You're listening to the Parent Pod Podcast by Gymboree Play and Music with Adonica Shaw, a weekly conversation about early childhood development topics for parents with children ages 0 to 5. While the content of this show is meant to be informative, it is not meant to replace the guidance of your physician, therapist, or pediatrician.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Parent Pod Podcast by Gymboree Play and Music. I'm your host, Adonica Shaw. Today, we are joined by the fabulous Rachel Bailey, who is a parenting specialist and who holds a master's degree in clinical psychology and a certification in positive discipline. She, in the past, has provided services as an ADHD coach to families. She's an in-home mentor and therapist, and she actually has 2 children of her own. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much for being with us. First and foremost, I want to say that you probably are getting quite a few of these interviews and requests in this time. You know, certainly we are living through a very interesting time in our lives because, you know, for the most part, none of us have been through a pandemic or something of this scale, particularly those of us who have very young children at home. We're learning a new normal for our families and for our lives. And so today we wanted to talk to you about some positive discipline methods that we can use, particularly for those children who are used to going to school or used to going to Gymboree Play and Music or used to having some level of an outlet for their energy, and how we can work through hiccups at home as things have gotten a little more difficult in May over the next couple of weeks here, when families are having to figure out how they're going to be able to reacclimate into the world, so to speak. And so today we're going to take a deep dive into that. And so I wanted to kind of get your input on how it is that you apply your methods and to tell us a little bit about what you specialize in, particularly in this time.
Absolutely. So always what I've specialized in is, helping parents have these practical tools, like including what to say and what does it all look like, how we can apply practical tools to things like discipline. That's one area of expertise I have. But also I work with a lot of parents whose kids have big emotions, maybe strong-willed kids who maybe some of the traditional discipline strategies that they've used before haven't worked. Or we have kids who are melting down a lot and parents are saying, well, this isn't really a discipline issue, but my kids have such big emotions and they're not so resilient. So I work really on the how do we raise responsible kids, but I also work with how do we raise resilient kids who have healthy self-esteem, because ultimately self-esteem is also related to resilience and behavior. So those are really the areas where I focus. I always have focused in those areas. And yes, right now, absolutely, there are a lot of questions about behavior and anxiety and resilience for sure.
So I do have a question about that. So when you say big emotions, what does that mean exactly?
Oh, I love talking about this because I think almost every family has a child with big emotions. So what I mean by that are when maybe kids don't get their way, they're frustrated or disappointed, and their response to that is disproportionate to what just happened. So you tell your child, if you have a younger child, you tell them that, no, you can't have your yellow cup because it's in the dishwasher, and they just lose it. Or they imagine that, things are going to go a certain way, like they're going to be able to go to the playground. Even if you haven't told them they're going to be able to go to the playground, they imagine it's going to go that way. And then when it doesn't go that way, they just melt down, and they feel things really, really strongly.
Okay, so I have to say I have a 3-year-old, and this is sounding all too familiar to me. Yeah. So I think last night we had an episode where, so I have 2 different types of milk. I have almond milk, and then I have whole milk. And so, I usually use the almond milk for my milkshakes or protein shakes and whatnot. On occasion, the baby might want it. And so we were out of almond milk. And so both options were not available. And so I only directed him to the whole milk. And then chaos ensued because this quote unquote staple that we normally have wasn't available. It had nothing to do with my denying it to him, so to speak, as much as it was, he just was not used to not having that option, and then proceeded to kind of turn into a little mini tornado
Yes,
around the
exactly.
house. I'm envisioning, who is that? I think it was Looney Tunes Taz, the
Yes,
Tasmanian devil,
devil.
morph and then like tear up everything in its path, excuse me. And so I can certainly understand what you're talking about. And I obviously feel like, after a certain hour in the evening, it just intensifies so much more. And so for parents that are dealing with that, particularly, children that are 3, 4, and 5 that have kind of been stuck in the house and they've been put in this, everybody has been put in this kind of pressure cooker of dealing with thoughts and emotions and feelings in a very confined environment. What types of practical pieces of advice or what words would you encourage parents to use instead of you can't have that, or that's not possible, or unfortunately, and I'm going to put myself out there, or kind of get over it. Like, this is
Exactly.
life.
Which is what's instinctive. What our instinct is to, first of all, use logic to say, you know what, that milk isn't available. And second of all, then it is to say, get over it. And that is exactly what most of us do. And the reason that doesn't work, so let me back up and just say, when I teach anything to parents, I always really look at why is a child doing what they're doing? Because traditional discipline strategies don't care why a child is doing what they're doing. They don't care why they're melting down or jumping on the couch or talking back. It's just, let's nip it in the bud. But if you don't actually get to the cause of behavior, the behavior never goes away. And I always use the metaphor of, if you're weeding a garden and you take out the weeds by the tops and you don't get the root, well, the weeds keep popping back up. And that's often what happens with behavior or with these big emotions we see, because we're not addressing why a child is, responding in the way that they are. And ultimately, behavior is only a symptom. That's all it is. It's a symptom of what's going on inside, not just children, but adults too. So that's a whole other topic we could talk about. But we have to address the cause. What happens is when we use logic and we just say get over it, we don't address what's going on for the child. So very honestly, there are a couple of things that would happen for this child. Number one, they are probably feeling out of control as it is right now because, things are different for them, especially if you have the younger ones. They don't really get what's going on. They just sense that it's different. So they know that things are changing. Maybe there's not as much structure. Maybe parents are being more short with them because parents are home with them all the time. So they sense that something's changing. And the way their little brains work is they think, well, things are so different. I just want something to be the same. So then you say the almond milk isn't there and what they normally want isn't there. And it's like all of a sudden, oh my gosh, this is so hard to handle. Everything is out of control. And they're actually not responding disproportionately. They're responding in proportion to how big the feelings are inside of them. So the first thing is why they're doing this is because they're having all these feelings of being out of control. And this is one more thing. And also a 3-year-old does not have the capacity to maturely regulate their emotions. So not only do they feel something, and for big feeling kids, they feel things even more strongly, but then they don't have the tools to cope with that. So we are, expecting them to do something that even sometimes we can't do. And the last thing I will say about this, the reason what we usually do doesn't work is because when a human being is flooded with all of these emotions, like disappointment and frustration, and my world is, out of control, what happens is the brain interprets those emotions as a threat, like it's bad things are happening, and it turns on the fight or flight response. So that's what you're actually seeing in the meltdown. That's just their fight or flight response. They're turning all these big feelings out. They're melting down. And what happens when we're in fight or flight is that part of the brain actually shuts down the part of the brain that is able to regulate emotions or act mature and act calm. And it shuts down the part of the brain that is logical. So when we say to a child, the milk isn't there, all of these things that I just mentioned are happening in the background. So they can't hear logic. They're feeling all these things. They don't have the capacity to regulate these emotions. And all you're seeing is the symptom of that. And saying, well, the milk isn't there doesn't touch on any of that. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. I would think, for parents that are managing this at home right now, one of the things that we're witnessing, of course, is probably, obviously the influx of I wouldn't say behavioral issues, but the influx of talking to the children or a child about don't do that, or why would you react that way, or these are mommy's boundaries, mommy has to work kind of thing. And so if we're constantly in these cycles of trying to work with our children and help them understand the very logical part of our day, and us knowing that we need to get through it and help them kind of come along with the rest of the family, I feel like that could cause some level of stress or anxiety within parents because
100%. Because what's happening, and this is one of the biggest mistakes we make as parents, is we try to convince them of our agenda, like mom has to work right now, or no, you can't jump on the couch. And we're telling them all the reasons that they can't do what they want to do. We're not giving them the tools to act different, though. And that's why also a lot of traditional discipline strategies don't work, because they don't give the kids the tools they need. So let me actually talk about, I can tell you what to do in the moment when a child is melting down. But I also just want to give you an example of a tool that a child is missing. So if your child is jumping on the couch and you've asked them not to, and you keep saying, you know, we're not supposed to jump on couches, you know, that's not what we do. Well, the reality is the child is jumping on the couch because they are understimulated. And a child's brain is actually has a need for stimulation. It's a biological need, just like food and sleep, and they need stimulation. And so when we keep saying, don't do that, we're not meeting the need. However, if we just meet that need for the child, instead of saying, don't jump on the couch, don't jump on the couch, we actually help them find that stimulation. The behavior magically changes because we've met that need. So instead of just saying, don't do this, and here's my agenda, child, follow my agenda, what we really have to do is understand, why is the child jumping on the couch or melting down? Give them the tools they need, and all of a sudden, the behavior changes. And it really isn't magic, it's just science. When we work with our kids' brains instead of against them, everything changes.
so that's really interesting. So I have a question about this. So if, let's say your child's jumping on the couch and it might be, I don't know, 10:30 a.m. And somebody who might be working at home right now, or you have two parents working in the household, you've got a child who is kind of in need for that stimulation. How do you suggest that parents kind of organize their day? Um, I think for me, I've tried to figure out like, okay, is it better to do a block of learning in the morning? So maybe I'm working and doing workbook pages and coloring from like, I don't know, 9 a.m. to 11:30. Is it better to perhaps do some type of an organized activity, go back and pivot to your own personal work, or just have quote unquote family time, and then respond to their behavior with stimulation or with activities at the point that their behavior is out of alignment with, a stress-free household? How would you suggest that parents kind of delve out activities or attention to children, particularly because it might ebb and flow throughout the day?
Absolutely. And I think I want to start to give really practical tips, because I feel like I've been talking a lot about theory. So here's some practical tips. Number one, think about the rhythm of your child. I think the question you just asked, my answer is, it really depends on the child and when their energy highs are. Just recognize what's happened in the past. Do they tend to have more energy in the morning? And work with the flow of your child as much as you can. But sometimes you can't, because here's what I hear is that there's a conflict between when your child needs energy and when you have the energy to do your work. So if we're talking about working parents here, which I realize some are, some aren't, you really want to think about the flow of your child first if you can. But there's still things you can do. If you realize your child has a ton of energy between 10 and 11:30, but you have a work call or you have anything you have to do, you can still engage them. So let me give you an example. Maybe with a 3-year-old, 3-year-olds do really well with stimulation and novelty. So you bring out a new toy bin at 10 o'clock. Novelty, I'm talking to a lot of parents of young ones about rotating toys, and novelty is going to be great at that age. So you have to do something at 10, that's when they're highly energetic. Maybe you bring out a new toy bin, or maybe that's when at 9:30, you set up an obstacle course for them, and they're doing the obstacle course at 10, and they're moving their body because that's what they need to do at that time. So whenever we're thinking stimulation, we're thinking novelty, we're thinking, how can I engage their body in an activity? How can I engage their brain in an activity? So if you have a child who doesn't move as much, maybe your child is more of a colorer, how can I give them a coloring page at that time that's really going to engage them, whatever it is. So you're really just understanding your child. When I work with parents, I assume they're the expert in their child. I'm an expert in behavior and emotions, and we make plans based on what works for the child and what works for the parent. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. I love the way that you described this in terms of understanding the ebb and flow of your child's emotions or their rotating highs. I know that there's a direct correlation with my little ones, at least once we've had a meal or once, if they're doing workbook pages, it's like, oh, we can get through maybe 2 of them. And then I might be the one pushing for that third one, like just a little bit more quiet time, just a little bit more. But quite frankly, their attention span and their energy is pivoting to something else. And so I think my learning in this could be, okay, if you're introducing an activity or your child is wanting to do something else and you notice it being a pattern, then your job as a parent is to kind of show up for their change or their pivot or their own energy level and work with it to make sure that things work in more harmony. So
yes, and just keep in mind though that they have a limited attention span, but if you think engagement, stimulation, and novelty, and you use any of those tools. So novelty is anything new, you're going to get more time to yourself. You give them something new that will keep their attention. Stimulation could be just something that, really at engagement really uses their body in some way. So let's say you need an extra 15 minutes and your kids are playing with a toy. Say to them, okay, I challenge you to use that toy in a different way. And you may have to, with a 3-year-old, you're going to have to suggest the new way. But let's say they're playing with Legos. Say, hey, instead of building an airplane, can you make me a car? And you just change it up a little bit. And you create some novelty. Or like I said before, like let's say you need your kids to clean up, which is another kind of boring thing. If you say, hey, can you clean up with one hand behind your back, or with your tongue sticking out the whole time, or close one of your eyes, all of those things are engaging and stimulating and novel. You buy more time. So you don't always have to switch activities. You can really just think, okay, how can I make this activity more engaging or novel? And it'll buy you time.
Such good advice. One of the things I wanted to touch on, because I know we're getting closer to the end of the episode, but one of the things that you mentioned that you have worked with parents in the past with is helping them to kind of reduce the stress and the guilt that they may feel with needing to use different disciplinary actions, or how they've had to address their child's behavior, particularly if it's in a high stress time frame. I would say, currently now is a good example of that, so that they're not constantly feeling as though they are, I hate to say, over disciplining a child or giving too much energy to that child when they've done something negative. And so I wanted to just get maybe 2 or 3 practical things parents can do to help them manage their guilt level while they are employing some of these amazing strategies that you've discussed, and then just managing the day-to-day emotional levels and the day-to-day energetic levels within their household.
So I would say, if we're speaking specifically to what's going on right now with us being at home with our kids 24/7, the biggest piece of practical advice is related to expectations. So I want to talk about expectations, and I'm going to say 2 things you can do that are super practical. First of all, we have to reset our expectations right now on ourselves, potentially on our children, but I think even more on ourselves. So what happened, I've been working with parents for 10 years. So when this first happened, a lot of people were reaching out to me, and I was noticing in the very beginning that things shifted, but parents' expectations of themselves didn't shift. They actually increased. So maybe before we were worried about screen time, we were worried about how much sugar, how much, outdoor time, when our kids got to bed, we were worrying about all these things. And then we put on top of it, now I may have to do a job, or I may have to, there are all these additional things. I have to worry about their school. We didn't change our expectations, and we absolutely need to shift them to make them more realistic. Otherwise, we actually go into our fight or flight response, and we can't behave positively. So we have to shift our expectations. So let me just give you, here's the practical part. An example is, let's say screen time. Right now, maybe before the pandemic, you said, okay, my kids aren't going to be on screens for more than 30 minutes, an hour. A shift that is realistic would be, I'm going to make sure my kids are off of screens for at least 4 hours a day. They are off of screens. There are no screens around, but I'm not going to worry about the rest of the time, because you know what? It's maybe possible that putting them on screens give me time to myself that I need to be a better parent right now, because they're around me all the time. And if I don't get time to myself where they're not touching me or asking me for something, I'm going to be in this constant state of what I call yuck, which is basically fight or flight. So shifting an expectation just looking at it a little bit differently, like the screen time. And then for parents, this is my last tip related to this. For parents who like freak out when I say shift your expectations, make what I call a later list. And a later list is just a list of the things that you're right now shifting your expectations on, but you will come back to them later. That will actually reduce the anxiety in your brain, where you say, okay, right now I'm shifting screen time. Maybe I'm even shifting, how much time I am able to spend with them. We are definitely going to revisit it later. And when your brain knows you're going to come back to it, it can be a lot less stressful.
That is awesome. I've never heard of a later list.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's like revolutionary. I feel like I'm mind blown right now. Thank you so much for that. So I know that we are up against the end of the show, and I just have two more questions for you. So the first is for parents who would love to hear more about some of these strategies and about positive discipline strategies and how they can help manage big emotions for their little ones. What book would you recommend?
I think I'm going to say for the discipline itself, there is a whole positive discipline series. And there is one specifically, because I know we don't have a lot of time to read these days. There's one for positive discipline for toddlers if you have the young ones. And positive discipline, I do believe, is done by age. There is also Daniel Siegel does a lot of work on emotional regulation. He has The Whole Brain Child. So those are probably the two places I would go right now if you want to do a little bit more of what I talked about.
That's great. So for those of you who are listening, we're going to go ahead and tag those books in the description to this episode so that you can find them very easily. And for those of you who are wanting to continue the conversation with Rachel offline or off of this podcast, how can they get in touch with you, Rachel? Where should they reach out to you at?
So if they want to start with just more free information about everything I was talking about the behavior and emotions, I have a podcast myself that is called Your Parenting Long Game. And I have a Facebook group associated with it that's free. So Your Parenting Long Game podcast community. If you want to reach out to me, you can do that on Facebook or Instagram. I am at Rachel Bailey Parenting on both of those. And then my website you can also use to reach out to me. And I have some free resources on my website, and that's rachel-bailey.com. So any of those ways you can really reach me.
Thank you so much for that information, Rachel. And for those of you guys who have more to say about the information that was discussed in this episode, or if you want to sound off on the ways that you're managing your littles and their big emotions at home, feel free to post your comments online with the Gymboree Play and Music hashtag so that we can see them.
To learn more about this week's episode or the content discussed in the episode, be sure to follow Gymboree Play and Music on Facebook.